Thanks, Francisco. Thank you, Francisco. So statement number 1, our society aligns whiteness with affluence and blackness with poverty. If you strongly agree, are neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree, please respond to your answer with your answer. Our society aligns whiteness with affluence and blackness with poverty. Statement number 2. My success and my wealth are mostly a result of my hard work. What do you think about that one? From strongly agree to strongly disagree. Statement number 3. Education is a class equalizer. Keith had mentioned something around that. Allowing people the opportunity to transcend their socioeconomic status. What do you think on that one? Education is a class equalizer. Number 4, where I went to school, where I live, and the places I choose to work are a reflection of my class or socioeconomic upbringing. And finally, number 5, biracial identities, and this is kind of a United States-centric one in some ways, although there's definitely a global piece to this too. Biracial identities don't fit into our society's class structure. Great. And I'll give folks a moment to vote now. We got about half our responses in, but they're coming in fast. Just give it 30 more seconds. 31 votes in. Looks like it's coming to a head right there, Francisco. 5, 4. Okay, let's cut it. Great. And in a moment, our producer will share the results publicly. Does somebody, Amalia, do you want to help interpret and read these results out loud?
I will do my best.
Awesome.
So for question number 1, it looks like the majority of those who answered either agree or strongly agree, with a few of you coming in at more neutral stance. And that's the question about society aligning whiteness with affluence and blackness with poverty. The next question on my success and wealth are mostly a result of my hard work. It looks like there is almost an equivalent number of people who agree and strongly agree, and people who are disagree or are neutral, with a few that are strongly disagreeing. The next one is education is a class equalizer. And they're the largest group of you agree with that, with some strongly agreeing. Then there's some of you who are neutral, with a smaller degree of you disagreeing. It's pretty much across the board, with a few strong disagreeers. The fourth one, where I went to school, where I live, and the places I choose to work are a reflection of my class. Most of you agree, disagree, or strongly agree and agree, with a few of you disagreeing and a few of you feeling neutral about that. And the final question about biracial identities fitting into society's class structure. There's a small amount of you, one of you strongly agrees, then a larger group agree, equivalent group of you disagree, again, also equivalent strongly disagree, with some folks neutral. So this one is pretty evenly spread across the board in terms of responses.
Yeah, there's going to be some.
That one makes me curious.
I know, right? Let's make sure we tuck into that in our round robin this morning, and kind of surface energy from the panel, as well as see what comes up from the audience through that discussion. So let's open it up then, and maybe start with that, some reflections, particularly around that first statement. I'm curious, Anita, Keith, Amalia, hearing some of your thoughts on, do you think that we align whiteness with affluence and blackness with poverty? And when we say blackness, we're recognizing a spectrum of skin color tones. So we mean to incorporate Black, Indigenous, and people of color in that spectrum. We also mean to kind of center the fact that in our research and practice, the darker the skin tone, the more outsiderness is projected on one. So what are some of your thoughts? And maybe Keith will swing over to you first, and then Anita second, and Amalia third, as we create some equity on our own panel. What are some of your thoughts around whiteness aligning with affluence and blackness with poverty?
Yeah, I think it's a lot there, right?
Right.
First thing that comes top of mind is the concept of anti-blackness, which is something that is, in my opinion, is we see globally. And then when you align that with the race construct that puts whiteness above all other colors, and when we think about race being a social construct that was designed to essentially say who is worthy of resources, who is worthy of liberty, who is worthy of freedom. Whiteness is the currency that grants you that worthiness. And in thinking about anti-blackness at the bottom of that race hierarchy, it essentially has created systems that have positioned black people or people of color in general at the bottom of that social hierarchy, which results in oftentimes can result in the lack of resources. And obviously, we know people can get education, people can get access to resource, but we're talking about systems that position people, position groups of people in certain places. So one thing that comes to mind is access to housing, right? And we think about redlining and things like that. Government instituted systems that created situations where people weren't allowed to gain access to housing in certain areas, which then created more equity for some people in terms of home ownership, and then people who are in those redline communities were not granted that same privilege. So it can get very complex, but yes, I that question I agree with, and there's a lot more to it. But I'll stop there and looking forward to hearing some of the comments from my colleagues.
Appreciate you bringing in that systemic lens as well, and almost the counter experience to what my Jewish family with white skin experienced moving to Seattle. It's interesting too that you bring in that systemic experience. I remember, in the 80s, white people around me literally making comments like, Oprah Winfrey has made it. I wonder why the rest of them can't. And just this idea that, again, there's patterns and laws and practices that whole communities face, and there's a richer and deeper narrative around that.
Right.
Anita, coming over to you, how do you sit with this question in your corner of the world?
Well, I love what Keith has to say, especially around home ownership and really highlighting, the differences that have been generated because of the history around that, especially in the US. And what I would say is, that assumptions are dangerous. Some of this I think we can look to as fact, and then some of it is also something we need to ask ourselves in terms of assumptions. So for example, in just looking at some statistics recently, I noticed that Asians actually are among the higher income producers in the US. So it sort of challenges this white affluence perception that is there. And, just, I think causes me to think that a lot of this is about the imagination, that, and just going back, I think, to what Amalia was saying about accents. So for me, I know I have an accent, you can all probably hear it. So there are a number of assumptions associated with that that actually don't reflect the class that I'm in. So, I've just sort of left thinking about this, the assumptions that we make as it relates to this question.
Thank you, Anita. Amalia, I want to add a different layer on as we swing over to you, continuing from that question, but also coming in from, a Panamanian perspective and stepping outside the US. What is your experience with races being signifiers for different stratifications of class, even outside of the US?
Yeah, so I was thinking about, so often I talk with people who say, how do I recognize systemic issues? Like are there any tips about how I recognize my own unconscious biases? And to me, you have to get curious about things that seem the norm. And one of the things that seems the norm here in Panama, which I've seen across Latin America, and in my travels through India, when I've traveled through India, I've noticed it as well. And Anita, you'll tell me whether this resonates with you or not, is that when you look at advertisements, when you look at television, film, who are the people that are elevated in the culture as the ones you aspire to? They're all white. I mean, the lighter the skin, the more success in those arenas. And it makes me think about, and in Panama in particular, it extends to everyone who's in authority. When you look at who runs the government, when you look at people who are in charge in sort of the public sector, the private sector, it all reflects the same whiteness. And so, and Panama is largely a population of mixed race people. There's a lot of mestizaje, there's people who are African descended, people who are descended from original peoples. And so I would say like 80% of the population, but you see all of the public presenting people in authority are people who appear white or European. And so to me, that's like, that's very curious. And it makes me think about the impact on children who are looking at this growing up, thinking, I think about if you can see it, you can be it. So what you see says something to you about whether you can aspire to something, because maybe it reflects you or maybe it doesn't reflect you. So there's ways in which it continues to self-perpetuate because of this phenomenon that people don't see themselves reflected and sometimes may think, well, I can't aspire to that, so I might as well do something different or find some other way. I did want to just say something to Keith's point around education. And I remember hearing Dr. John Powell from the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society out of UC Berkeley. He talked about Barack Obama becoming president and this idea, well, now we've had the first Black president, and so clearly we're post-racial. And he talked about people opportunity as people riding up an up escalator versus people climbing up a down escalator. And that doesn't mean that no one's ever going to get to the top of a down escalator, but that's not how you want to do it. And it takes a certain amount of stamina and resilience and persistence to be able to make it to the top of a down escalator. And that's an illustration of one of the things that we talk about. And it always stuck with me, that image. It really resonated and I've never been able to shake it. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, and I'm thinking the downstream effects of even going up that escalator, as we're learning more and more through, our practitioners in trauma-aware care and somatics, the impact on body, and then how that translates through family dynamics and continues to impact a narrative that, wow, may be false for many of us in our conscious mind, structurally continues. So that's fascinating, Amalia. Well, let's use that. I definitely want to hear. Really wanting to hear some of our perspectives on some of the events pressing in our news, even in the past 2 weeks. But before we do that, let's add another layer to this idea of if race is a signifier of class and caste in US society and perhaps in larger society, and again, we're considering that idea here in this conversation, how does the biracial or multiracial identity press into that, especially when the latest round of census data revealed that we are moving in the direction, as we all know, of a majority minority country, majority non-white country, and some of the impacts that may have on this discussion as well. What are some of the different thoughts around there on multiracial, biracial identities? And this time, maybe Anita, if you would mind speaking first, and we'll just kind of switch around the orders.
Yeah, as the mother of a biracial child, I definitely have some perspective on this, and it is, I think for me, interesting in the US to see that, interracial marriage has only really been legal for 55 years, which then when you contrast to what Amalia was talking about the mestizaje community and intermixing that has happened in Latin America for centuries. So on the one hand, it's very flexible, very flexible organic system that has happened outside of the US. And then within the US, we've got this very recent emergence of biracial. So, and it's very fixed. So for me, I think there is this, it was interesting to see the results, how they were, I think in this case, the majority were in disagreement or strongly disagree. And I think it is because there is a bias towards light skin. And so if you are biracial, skin color is still a visual fact and is still taken into consideration, especially in this country where I think it's only 10% of the population are biracial. So it's changing quickly, but still, very different to, I think, how it's perceived in Latin America. I'd love Amalia's perspective on that.
Well, there's an invite, Amalia.
Wow, I mean, so much there. Anita, I just wrote down bias towards light skin which you said, which is, I think, so true in my experience. And there's, I think about how we internalize the isms and how we then play those out on each other. I think about how there are external factors to our communities that have a vested interest in keeping our energy pitted against each other, as opposed to united and figuring out how we can rise together or change things. And that this scarcity mentality is something that plays out in our own communities around this stuff. I was thinking about that Lyndon B. Johnson quote around, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. And then he went on to say, give him somebody to look down on and he'll even empty his pockets for you, which again, another thing that has never, it's sort of burned in my memory around this stuff in particular. There is a expression in Latin America, and it's cross countries that I've heard, and it's about mejorando la raza. It's about how you improve the race. And so there is there's an aspiration in families that if you have children who are lighter skinned, and then you marry them to someone who is even lighter skinned, then their children will continue to improve the race. And so when I hear about the bias towards light skin that Anita spoke to, I'm reminded of how many times I was told, you are improving the race and you need to keep improving the race. So it's so prevalent, I think, among in our communities and among us, and it's so ingrained that it's not even a conscious thing. You know, it's lore that we pass on to our children and their children, and we don't even think about the damage it does or where it comes from. How colonization set up this stratus, you know, this caste system, again, to be able to control people and to be able to gain wealth from the labor of others and the resources of others. So, and I know I can't wait to hear Heath talk about this, because I heard him talk about it last time we were together around how the history of the US connects to color, skin color, and, you know, what the expectations were about who you were and what you did based on your skin color, that continues to resonate today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a saying, you know, when people get together, they get together, right? And you might have to take a second to catch the meaning of that, but I mean, it's been an effort to keep people separate, right? And with that separation, we're not going back to redlining. Why was it so important to keep certain members of our society separated, right? That separation creates the power dynamic, that creates the hierarchy, that again, you know, creates a system where whiteness is the authority, whiteness is deemed as worthy, and others are less worthy. So, you know, I can't really speak on, you know, biracial identity or anything like that. I won't step into that arena. But what I do know is our country has done a great deal of work to create systems to keep people separated, and we do know like skin color is important when we think about representation, who we see on television, who we see in leadership positions. You know, people tend to aspire to be what they see. So, you know, there's a lot to be said about, you know, biracial identity. But again, what I do know is there's been systemic efforts to keep people apart, and I think that's to maintain that whiteness, that hierarchy, that keeps certain people in power.
When people get together, There's a bumper sticker for you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you three have really explored that topic well. My lived experience, and it came across largely as a classroom teacher. I was a classroom teacher both in Philly and in Tacoma, and I definitely worked with a lot more mixed race children in Tacoma on the West Coast, Tacoma, Washington. And just anecdotally, I noticed it, like if the parents were raising the child with kind of a treat everyone the same mentality or a colorblind mentality, and they were lighter skinned, that often there was a bit of more social alignment with the white students in that equation. And I can't say that the parents were doing that to kind of marry up the social ladder. It didn't seem like that, but it did seem like it was more back to the idea, we you know, by creating a new life, we've gone post-racial. And maybe on an individual level they had, because they were experiencing life different with each other and their child, but it doesn't mean that transforms society around it. And that's back to this point that we keep making of how do we come together to create a more inclusive, equitable society. So let's come in. Oh, yes.
No, yeah, there was one more thing that I wanted to say about that, and that is when a person is biracial, there is also this tension around, can you fully own and embrace all aspects of your identity? How are you viewed? And, you know, thinking about the one drop rule, it's like if I have any Black in me, then I am considered Black, period, regardless of my physical appearance. And how that bleeds into immigrant communities coming in and our experiences of that. And the whole discussion about whether you are enough, white enough, or brown enough or maybe not white enough nor brown enough, and so the limbo that many people who are biracial can exist in, and it is debilitating. It has a debilitating impact on your self-confidence, your sense of place in the world, and your and who you are, your identity, which is one of the most core things to each of us. And so I just wanted to say that because I think that that is an additional energetic struggle that people navigate because of the dynamics of racism globally, not just the United States, I think.
I would love, you know, in real time, that's actually a point that's always been a little confusing for me, that exact what you said. I'd love to hear that a little more, and I want to see if I'm hearing you correctly. But you know, I've definitely heard and have witnessed for, you know, different skin tones getting rejected from different groups on a social level. And I think what I hear you saying is that biracial kids can sometimes be rejected from both groups. We're not creating a hierarchy of oppression here. I don't believe in that, but I'm confused by that statement. If we are saying that Blackness equates often with the bottom caste, then I have seen that rejection from the Black group, and this is as a white man, so I'm an outsider here, but I've seen that more when biracial kids are not necessarily wanting to align with the quote unquote lower caste or darker skin group. I haven't seen it because the darker skin group is rejecting that. I'm just wondering what some more thoughts on you, because I've seriously thought about this for years, and I've wondered about this.
Yeah. So I will just say that I can speak to my own experience as an immigrant and as a Latin American, which is different than what you're speaking to. And I'll let others speak to your particular point. So yes, there's truth to what you say. And there is an experience that immigrants to the United States can have that is about trying to figure out where their places or where we fit, where our places and where we fit. I'm gonna use myself. So that after living in the United States for a while, I still would feel like an outsider because I was still very conscious of how different I was from others who were US born, particularly white US born, even though I looked the way I looked. I was never white enough. And then I would go back home, and then I would get, well, now you're from the US, you're not from here anymore because you have changed. There's something about the experience of being there that has changed you. And so you exist in a limbo that's like, are you Latina enough? Are you white enough? You are not enough of either necessarily. And it's not even so much a literal rejection as it is a questioning of your identity, and enough that it begins to make yourself question. Okay, so where do I fit and where do I belong? And I think that, I mean, for me, I have come to a place where I'm at a place of peace with who I am and where I am and all the different things that make me up. But I think that for my sons who are biracial and are young and sort of starting out as young adults, their struggle is, they're in the middle of that struggle that I was in when I was younger. So I see it repeated with this next generation.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that in.
Okay. Add something to that, Noah.
Please.
I'm not biracial. I can't speak to that particular experience. But what I have noticed and have heard from, you know, friends who are biracial, that there's this, when I think about the quote unquote rejection from the Black community, what I've seen is more so about when that particular individual who may be biracial, in this case is when you're not even biracial, it's when you're perceived to be aligning yourself with whiteness. And once that perception is there, that's when an individual can feel rejected. And it could be intentional or it could be unintentional, but it's really rooted around the perception of one attempting to align themselves with whiteness. It could be the Black kid who is into anime at school, or or is, the skateboarding is something that's seen that we think white people do, or you play golf. So that's when that rejection, when I witnessed that kind of rejection, is really rooted in that attempt or perception of the attempt to align with whiteness. And it could be achieving to get good grades, right? It could be, you got your master's degree, though, that once you start ascending and when certain people don't see themselves as having that ability, they start to question how you were able to get in that position. And that could be skin color, that could be the activities that you enjoy to engage in, and then again, that's where I've seen that perceived rejection come from. When it comes to people feeling rejected from their white family, I mean, that's just racism, right? Like that's you're not white, and white people don't deem you as white. And when you're trying to align yourself with that, people of color feel like you're trying to separate yourself from them, and that you think you're better because your skin is lighter. So that's kind of what
you can break the class and caste in a sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes back to that. And we talked about even white people, like my Jewish ancestors and probably some of Amalia's, and just the assimilation of even Europeans coming to America over waves of immigration, although not forced, but still escaping bad situations. And again, just the letting go of some of that culture to move into a different caste and class box in some ways. Yep. Well. Are any other thoughts on biracial and on maybe skin coloration, how that plays out in communities, before I bring in another question for us to chew on?
Yeah, no, I'll just chime in and say, this conversation is making me really think about the danger of the binaries, whether it's light and dark, black and white, upper class and lower class, and how those can be so polarizing and prevent us from really thinking about, collective Black, anyone that is not white appearing, and the power that could come from thinking that way versus in the binary. And it, I think, was prompted by Keith's comment about separation. And I think one of the reasons that we're wanting to have these conversations is because we do want to appreciate the complexity of the intersectionality of all the differences. And so I think this conversation is making me realize, and I think of the complexity of looking at all the lenses, including religion, which, I think we may end up touching on, but it's, so we can no longer talk about race or class separately. They're so interrelated.
Agreed. Yeah. And I love that last point too, that, it's equity and equality. Like I at least in I think when we put everyone in the same group, like people of color, what I've heard from my particularly Black colleagues over the years is we've lost sight of the anti-Blackness in that. And if we only focus on anti-Blackness, then there's a large swaths of people that could be included in a larger dialogue of inclusion that may feel left out. So I don't have a perfect answer. I'm also not physically a part of either of those communities. So I'm just speaking from my lens, but I love that, Anita. I love the care what you just put in those words. Well, I'm going to take your invite to swing into religion a little and come back and doing it by way of, there's a lot of, I feel, current news, headline news topics that, to use Amalia's phrase, overlay with race and class. Just going at a few of them: Hurricane Ida, what we've referred to in the US society as the great resignation of particularly women of color, and then many others leaving their workplaces in the past year following the murder of George Floyd and COVID, and people realizing this is not a good balance for me, or this work is toxic to my I cannot have a sense of belonging in this workplace. We have the abortion laws that have just passed, and will wherever you come in from that will certainly have an impact on class and caste. We even have white men in the media lately that have said, I only shower once a week, and got some flack on that, not recognizing that statement very much ties into historical perceptions of class and caste and humanness and credibility and worthiness. So there's a lot going on a current event level. Anybody have any hot takes with kind of how you see some of the current events playing out and some intersections of class and caste in any of the ones I mentioned or beyond?
Yeah, I'll start it off. I'll go with probably the most provocative one. The abortion laws that were just passed. There's some that argue that is an attempt to maintain whiteness, to maintain the white majority, and there's a fear that about white women aborting babies, it will decrease the white population. And so it's an attempt to maintain power by being a majority, which is, in my opinion, rooted in fear, is rooted in a scarcity mentality, and is essentially a way to maintain power. Thinking about some of the other topics, Hurricane Ida, it makes me think somebody that's has the privilege of being an elected official. It makes me think about infrastructure, or the lack of investment in infrastructure in certain communities and certain neighborhoods. And I know historically, lower income, poor neighborhoods tend to have worse infrastructure. Streets have not been invested in, roads and bridges have not been invested in,
or built through the community itself.
Exactly. And now we're seeing the impacts of that lack of investment, with flooding and things like that. I'm sure we've seen the images of New York City. And that's pretty scary. So, again, like when people say, why does everything have to be about race? I mean, we live in a country that has essentially made everything about race. And if you're not aware of that, I think people of color tend to be more aware of that. I've had conversations with colleagues who, say, when they walk out the door, they don't think about their whiteness, or they just, they were in their mid-20s when they start realizing that they were white. I knew I was Black at 4 years old, so that idea of not being awareness of your identity in itself is a privilege, to navigate the world in bliss, essentially, not thinking or thinking about how whiteness impacts your life, where, for me, I think about how my skin color impacts every aspect of my life and my identity.
You just said two things that I really want to pick up on and pass it around. One, that sense of white people, myself included, not necessarily growing up thinking about our skin color. And in this conversation, the four of us, and that doesn't mean everyone else out there agrees with us, but we are equating in many ways skin color and class. So that would also imply that many white people didn't necessarily grow up thinking about money in the same way of survival, or if they did and came from less than, including my family, it was seen as an individual journey to overcome explicitly through something like education, as opposed to, yes, and there needs to be systemic transformation that invests in communities equitably, which is a point you made a second ago, Keith. We're also looking at and seeing in COVID the revelation that when we let communities go due to racism and classism, not only are we oppressive to our fellow peoples, but we're seeing the economic coming of that, the chickens coming home to roost in the larger society at whole too, and it brings the whole thing down. So that's the part, it felt taboo to, like, I do practice capitalism, and I do make money in my family now. And it was taboo to question the limitations of capitalism in mainstream society 10 years ago. I feel even certainly longer than that. And I feel like we're getting to the point now where we can intelligently ask questions like that. And the fear of that needs to recede so that we can actually look at better systems. Amalia, Anita, what are some of your boiling thoughts?
So there's a couple things that come to mind after hearing Keith. One thing is just recently, my husband and I went back to the United States. My husband's African-American, and we went back to the States to see one of our kids. And as we were preparing to travel, we were having a conversation. He said, I have to prepare myself because I have to remember. He said, here in Panama, I'm just a man. But we're going back to the States and I have to remember I am a Black man and not just a man. So I have to build up my armor again before I show up. And it's just, I mean, having a front row seat to his life as his spouse really is a tremendous education. It's enraging and it's moving. And anyway, so hearing Keith talk about that just reminded me of that conversation we had about identity and being conscious of who you are and how the world sees you for your own safety, just at the very baseline, just a survival thing. And then thinking about Texas and thinking about the fact that this does not eliminate abortion. It just eliminates it as an option for poor people, for poor women, many of whom are women of color, right. Puts them in danger in terms of seeking help for situations where they can't carry a pregnancy, their health is in jeopardy, or whatever is going on for them at that moment. Because rich women will be able to figure out how to take care of themselves. They'll leave Texas and go to a neighboring state. They'll go to a private practitioner. That it will not affect women who have resources. So what's going on in Texas is very connected to class. And again, when you overlay demographics to class, it turns out that the people who are going to be most impacted are going to be women of color.
Seems like such a rudimentary school of thought too. It reduces people of color to chattel, and it reduces poor white people to trash in the parlance of our language, because those would be the two predestined tracks for the lowest class. I mean, it is such a, as Keith said earlier, scarcity mentality, and then you connect it to the persevering problems of the moment. You're like, we cannot think like a 1-year-old and solve those problems that are going on now. It's almost infuriating. Anita, where are you checking in from? How do you feel about this and the current issues in particular? What's on your lived experience in mind?
Yeah, I think to amplify Amalia's point, whatever the natural disaster or man-made disaster, the rich always will find a way out, whether it's flying out of a storm, flying out of the state to find an abortion, flying to the moon in the face of a natural, the climate change, right? So all of those, I think, exist. But bringing it back, I think, to COVID, especially when I think about the impact COVID has had on the Asian community and the Asian hate that resulted from, what was often referred to as the Chinese virus or the Indian variant, those explicit namings invoking perhaps more hate against Asians. And then, the resulting atrocities in Atlanta, 6 working class Korean women, in Indianapolis, 4 working class Sikhs among the dead. But in both cases, I think just the vulnerability of Asians and I think in general, throughout maybe even US history, the vulnerability of Asians in particular, when it comes to issues disaster. You know, if you think about 9/11 and the impact then on Asians of 9/11, regardless of whether you're a Muslim or not, you know, a number of people suffered from that. So I think I'm trying to stitch together this notion of, you know, disaster, how the impact on individuals of race, and then especially if they're in a certain class. So.
It also makes me think about how important it is to know your history, because if you don't know your history, you can't connect those threads, and you just take things at face value. So I think about COVID, to Anita's point, and I remember seeing a documentary about the Pima people who were displaced and put in a reservation. They were agricultural people. Where they were put, it was unworkable land. So they became dependent on government rations, which were all high fat, high salt. Over generations, they've developed the highest, at that time of the documentary, things may have changed, but the highest rates of obesity and diabetes among a population group. There's also a lot of poverty. You know, when you make your life from agriculture, you can't grow your own food, then how do you bounce back from something like that as a people with no resources? And then something like COVID hits, where underlying conditions make you more prone to having serious effects from COVID and dying from COVID. And so when you connect all those dots, it's like, wow, you know, there has been governmental influence that has resulted in people being more at risk of dying of something like COVID when it shows up. And if I don't know that, then I'm just like, oh, you know, people with diabetes, or yeah, okay. And I don't connect the dots that there was actually decisions that were made that resulted in this.
Right. Structural decisions. You know, there's a lot of energy coming in on our chat box too around the idea of class and caste creating information boxes, which further reinforce darker skinned people experiencing lower caste in society. And I wanted to read this powerful statement from an anonymous statement from one of our attendees. There are many people who have been able to build wealth because of access to information they gained from their parents and community. How to invest in real estate, stocks, start a business, etc. As a Black person born in the 70s, that information was not taught to us at all. It was decades later before I learned anything. And even then it was taught as just a concept, but not how to actually do it. That is still much the case, but the internet is making it more available. However, the best secrets are still held tight within preferred communities. Also, years ago, if you wanted to ever become a leader in a company, you knew you needed a bachelor's. Now, with more people of color holding bachelor's, it's like that bachelor's is equivalent to a high school diploma.
Yes.
So the game is changed up. I don't believe it equals the playing field when we keep changing the rules of the game to limit upward mobility. However, I do believe as long as we all receive equal information, we can make something happen for ourselves. I really like that statement. I'm wondering if anybody wanted to riff off of that for a minute, since there was some energy around information in the chat box and how information is either accept as an insider or an outsider, how different communities get financial information and how it's practiced and shared. The idea of upward mobility. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll start. You know, the idea of certain communities not having access, that's absolutely true. When I think about, you know, growing up in Philadelphia, growing up in poverty, you know, poverty becomes essentially a mindset, right? It becomes a way of life in a lot of ways. You just
Also, Keith, would you, if you would share a thought?
Yeah, you know, it does become part of the culture in some ways. And when you think about information, what's being fed to particular communities, when I say fed, I mean you know, the music, the entertainment, you know, the lack of grocery stores. You know, we think about food deserts and things like that. And we have people, you know, in one area that is constantly circulating the same information amongst each other, right? It's really hard to break out that cycle. And oftentimes it takes, individuals, to like tap into that to say, hey, there's another way to do this. But information is important, but really is how do you show people how to do that thing? How do you show people how to manage their finances? If you have a poor mom who's been struggling, trying to raise her children on her 9 to 5 with very little resources, she's basically in survival mode. So when I go back to Philadelphia, I see a lot of people surviving, right? And I often tell people when I moved to Tacoma, that's when I learned how to thrive, and was able to break out of the cycle of just surviving, right? And that takes a lot of work and dedication, and that takes a community, right? To thrive, you don't thrive alone, right? You thrive because you're surrounded by other people who are doing certain things. And that could be focused on education, that could be focusing on financing. So it's a lot there. So when we think about why people are stuck in certain communities, it's intentional, and it takes a lot to break out of that.
When I hear intentional, I don't need it, Amalia. Is that one of us dinging, by the way? I think that's the universe telling us we got great ideas percolating discussion. When I hear intentional, like I can imagine upper class listeners, white listeners thinking, man, I'm not trying to keep Keith and South Philly in a box. Right. And as we're discussing here, this has been going on for a long time. So there has to be some level of, if not intentionality, at least culture and practice that enables these large spread behaviors and experiences to continue. I guess I wonder what some thoughts are in addition to the impact. Actually, first off, equity requires us to focus on the impact of outsiders first. And what is the impact of that on insiders? If I mean, again, I'm seeing our whole society going down at the moment right now. The inequity rising to such a level that we don't have, it seems like, the will, the energy, the resources to rise above it. And I'm just wondering, is there an impact on larger society as well when we consciously and unconsciously practice disinvestment in communities?
Yeah, I could jump on that real quick. No, I won't take too much time. Thinking about the upper class white guy, at
or middle class,
right? Like, where I'm not doing anything to those people, right? Like that kind of mindset. And the reality is, in a lot of ways, it's yes and no, right? One, you don't have to do anything because the cycle is so embedded in particular communities. You don't have to. But then at the same time, as somebody who's in the role as an elected official, and I get to look at data and statistics on what neighborhoods or what communities are struggling the most, and you can look at crime statistics and things like that and see, like, okay, there are certain zip codes in my city that the crime is happening in, right? Then you look at poverty and you look at, okay, well, wow, man, poverty is really, really high here. And wow, there's no grocery stores here. There's a lot of liquor stores here, right? So you start, putting all those pieces together. And then when you start talking about, well, how do we solve that problem? Well, let's invest resources in that particular community. If we know a lot of the crime is lower, and we're not talking about organized crime here, right? We're talking about low level, misdemeanors, sometimes felonies, things that are generated because of poverty, because of the lack of resources. So I call them crimes of desperation. We talk about the lack of mental health support. If we poured resources in those particular areas, with oftentimes may be communities of color, when we start talking about putting resources there, that's when the conversation tends to stop, right? And it makes me question, well, why? Like, if we say we want to solve the problem, and we talk about equity, why not pour resources in this particular zip code that's giving us 80% of our crime statistics, right? If we really wanted to solve the problem, but then it makes me question, well, we don't do it because, people of color are deemed as not worthy. And then when you start putting resources in communities of color, and then white communities start questioning that, and now you got constituents who are questioning why you're doing certain. So it just becomes this cycle of, well, those people aren't worthy of resources because whatever, right? And you could add all the reasons why certain people aren't deemed less worthy.
Thank you for that thoughtful share back. Amalia, Anita, additional thoughts on that around the impact of society on large when we disinvest, or there is no equity to social investment?
Well, I think, sorry, Amalia, go.
No, please go ahead.
For me, Keith mentioned the word constituents. So it raises the question of power. And in many ways, if we keep talking about race, then we're not talking about class. And so those who are in power continue to stay in power. So that was just something that came up for me. Although I totally agree with the need to invest in places that need to be invested in. But I think all of it is a play to hold on to power.
We are pushing the buttons this morning. Amalia, what do you think?
Well, what I was going to talk about a little bit is the idea of if we were to invest in places in our communities that are most in need, then I think there's a lot of data that suggests that all of us end up benefiting from what comes out of those efforts. So 2 really quick examples of that.
Yeah.
One was I worked in a place that didn't have one of those disability access doors where you push the button and the door opens. A lot of debate about whether or not we needed to do that and how many people who are mobility impaired actually access the building, and was it was really expensive, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, the decision was to put one in. And what I noticed immediately was there were more people with disabilities who were coming into the building. I also noticed that women pushing strollers or men pushing strollers were using that door. UPS delivery people carrying packages, people loaded down with lunch items, people who rode their bikes to work. So many people were benefiting from this door, way more so than people who had mobility impairment statistically. Thinking about a situation in Seattle where there was a particular neighborhood where street lights were frequently out, and there was a correlation there with people's safety. And there was some curiosity about why it was that this particular area of town, which was largely inhabited by immigrant folks and people of color, was largely dark. Well, they discovered that it was because the way you get a light changed is that you have to call and report the number of the pole. And many people didn't have phones. Many people were concerned about calling local government to ask for anything. And so the streets remained dark. The fix for this ended up being setting all the lights on a rolling schedule because the bulbs had a life expectancy. And so it was easy to say, well, we put these bulbs in today, and a year from now, these bulbs have to be changed. So we now have a rolling schedule. All the lights in the city get changed. That means people in more affluent neighborhoods don't have to go out there, get the number of the pole, make the phone call. They just know that their bulbs are changed on a regular schedule, and now their streets are lit consistently. Everyone benefits from the fix that takes care of an inequity. And that's the thing we don't talk enough about. And I'd like to think, the human side of me would like to think, we want to do it because it's the right thing, the human thing to do. And some people need to know what's in it for me. And there are benefits to be had.
Absolutely. I think both sides are legit. And I mean, for me, that's why we are talking about class and race together. About 15 years ago, and even now, sometimes we come across clients that say, our company motto is, or the non-printed company motto is hire for diversity, model for sameness. And I really think that clicks in around race as well. I think a lot of times that even when companies practice diversity, and let's say they're even willing to practice diversity on the lens of race, the class piece isn't applied. And so I think sometimes it's like, who's a best fit for this company or leadership role? We want some diversity, but we're not going to add in the dimensions of class and some other perspectives that might really challenge this system and bring in new voices. Challenge being a good thing, by the way, helping grow and make the system more inclusive and belonging. So I think about that a lot of times, how, it still seems like diversity is the optics, but it's the inclusion piece of like, okay, let's go beyond that and let's find people of color from different communities. Let's go lower down on all people on that income ladder. Let's look at our educational barriers. I don't see that type of talk emerging yet from many companies.
Just wanted to add real quick. I love what Amalia talked about, those structural things that were intended to help one particular group, and that effect. There's a term for it. It's called the curb cut effect, right? When you think about curb cuts, which were designed for people with wheelchairs, think about the skateboarder, the mom with the stroller. That curb cut had so many impacts that people probably didn't even think about when it was created. So I just love that concept.
It's the opposite of scarcity mentality too. It's that the abundancy, and it's hard. It's hard to get. I mean, I sometimes think as a white dude that emerged in a middle class, and upper middle class at this point, I can see some of the ways that even what I spiritually disagree against, also maybe still in my behaviors, I start to get a little more protective of my resources, and I have to unpack that a little bit. And I'm like, wait a second, I finally got here. Like I catch myself doing that kind of stuff sometimes in little ways. And I really do intentionally surround myself with a lot of different folks from kind of communities that practice for inclusion and equity, because it helps remind me of that larger picture. And it does help me remind me of the curb effect is good for everyone, including the fact that I have a daughter in this world. And when I go, I need this world to be a healthy, vital place for her to feel included in herself. So I like that long-term piece, that, back to the idea of capitalism used to be this taboo thing we can't touch. And the idea that we can't talk about short-term profits without looking un-American. It's funny, like Beyonce has this quote that says, racism is so American that to question racism makes you look un-American. I'd say the same for classism. I mean, I really, at 43, I feel like I just about now have the permission, even as a white dude, middle class, to talk in public spaces, including this one, about the limits of class and caste in any system. It's interesting to me. It's interesting. We have a final question we're going to bring in a moment, but I just want to turn to the three of you. Any final thoughts that maybe I or we did not surface that you would like to bring up for consideration, reflection, or a story you want to put in the pot?
I think, Noah, you asked earlier, and we didn't really touch on it, about class outside of the US.
Yes, yeah.
And, I really started, I thought about that, and I had some hypothesis about there being a difference between those countries that were colonized and those that were not. I think I learned recently 80% of the planet was colonized at one point of time or another. But unfortunately, I couldn't really think of a difference. I even looked at those 10 countries that weren't colonized to see if I could, but I think at the end of the day, what I realized is there is a ruling class and a working class wherever you go, and associations with each. So it was unfortunate, but it just seems to, it seems to be pretty predictable that those classes exist.
Thank you, Anita. Back, this outsider, insiders, and class and caste being one of the hardest dimensions to discuss at times. I really am appreciating the three of you and our whole team behind us holding space for this. Before we move into our final question, I wanted to bring in two quick slides, recognizing that we've used class and caste a lot in this discussion. And earlier, I forgot to bring in kind of the definitions that we're riffing off of each of those. I wanted to offer those to our audience now. Francisco, if we could bring those in one at a time. Thank you so much. So in this conversation that we have been having, Keith, Amalia, Anita, and myself, we've been using class and thinking about it as a group sharing the same economic or social status or social rank. And caste has been a division of society, as Anita was just talking about, based on differences of wealth, inherited rank of or privilege, profession, occupation, or race. So we just wanted to, again, share those with you. And by way of that, we're going to open up our final question, which is going to be an inclusive question for everyone out there. We're really interested in hearing, how can you use your privilege for better inclusion when it comes to class or classism? And we'll go around and roundtable on our panel as a way of checking out. But also we want to invite everyone out there, and thank you, all of you, for hanging on and staying involved in the conversation, to share your own thoughts in the chat box about ways that you may be able to use your class privilege, if you have it, for better inclusion when it comes to class and classism. And so we'll round robin out with our panel on this as well. And anybody want to take a first stab at, or plant the first seed at how to use your class privilege, if you identify as having it, for more inclusion and for more equity?
You know, I can go first. I'm inspired by the quote that you read out by one of our participants, and you know, who talked about the information, but also I think I feel a responsibility to pay it forward. And so what information I do have, to be able to share that more broadly, and to, I almost feel like it's a moral duty as someone who has moved through those classes to reach back and lift others up. So that's, I think, why I'm in this work.
Thank you, Anita. Keith or Amalia?
Yep. Yeah, I think similar to I think for me, it's about giving back and helping to create opportunity. You know, not, I'd never assume like the way I've done it is the way that it needs to be done, but I could provide, you know, a young person or insight on how to navigate certain systems, right? I could create opportunity and create space. And I think another thing for me is important is, you know, never forget where I came from, right? And I mean, we're all operating in the structures or confines of capitalism. And honestly, I don't know how not to at this point in a lot of ways. So I recognize that, and I recognize that I'm a part of a system that can be toxic and destructive. And in recognizing that, it helps me create more self-awareness on how I engage with others, and how and just attempt to do my best not to be a part of the problem under the guise of being part of the solution.
Thank you, Keith. Amalia?
So I think about my husband and I, our personal journey around this, and how he was a financial advisor for many years with a large company, global company, but in the United States. And he specifically, to his own career detriment, because that was not encouraged, went into communities to teach children how to save, to create contests with giveaways for those who saved the most over a period of time, and to teach parents all of those secrets around what are the ways that wealth gets created, in the United States, under this capitalist umbrella, as you said, Keith. And I think about the ways in which we constantly make ourselves available for anyone who wants mentorship, anyone who wants referrals or references for jobs. Whenever a job comes open, we're always thinking, who are the people of color that we know who are professional and working to get to a particular level in their career? Who are the people who come from poverty, who are struggling and working their way up? How do we not just connect them with a job opening, but if we have a personal connection with the employer, can we make a strong case for this person being considered seriously, so that we're not just cold handing off, but really building a connection, setting up ways for people to have informational interviews with people in corporations, so they begin to get to know the environment and the players within workspaces. What are our minimum qualifications for employment? Do they have to be what they are? Can we look for different ways to assess expertise in someone that doesn't mean degree upon degree upon degree? Clearly you don't want to hire a surgeon who doesn't have the right qualifications, but so often we're bringing in people who really need people skills, who need expertise that can be gained through experience rather than degrees, or that maybe they have a degree but haven't had the experience. And we understand that people get hired at different rates. So how do we critically look at how we use what we use to make decisions on hiring, so that we can open the doors to people who maybe have not had opportunity in the past but would be amazing employees?
Well, you got a shout out as you were offering that wisdom, Amalia, and thank you to the other commentators. Seen some people of privilege saying I speak up and disrupt, seen some others saying I share information. Love hearing that. I'll go on a similar theme from the last time we were together. Now that I'm certainly, I would not consider myself wealthy, but I would label myself upper middle class, which means I do have some discretionary income. And on large and small scales, our family does buy Black and brown. And what that literally means is, from supplies around the house to contractors that we hire, from services that we procure to literally clothing that we buy Black and brown. Those companies don't just hire Black and brown people, they also hire white people. Back to the idea that, the curb effect, equity is good for everybody. I think that we have to begin seeing ourselves and others. And when I mean that, I mean people of upper middle class and people with white skin have got to see our economic survival and our planet's survival and others, or we're shooting a losing game right now. But I do that. In large and small ways, that's how I live my life. And I do think that is a part. You cannot buy your way out of anything, but we operate under the umbrella that Keith mentioned. And that's a way of sharing energy. That's a way of making my family life richer, because I make new connections and I meet talented people and my life becomes better. And that's a way of literally, I believe, again, not just having a Black Lives Matter sign in front of my house, but actually signifying with energy and resources behind it that equity matters. We have a couple more posts, a couple more chats in here. Oh, no, that's Amalia talking to the panelists. There you go. So we're going to bring in our closing quote now, Francisco. Well, I think I have the closing. Well, so we just want to we'll thank all the participants for spending the past 90 minutes with us. Don't forget that we have another part of this series, Back to Class, coming up in October. And that time, in the next session, my colleagues and myself will be explicitly exploring the overlays of class, caste, and race in the workplace, really boiling down to how does some of this outsiderness, insiderness transfer into workplace culture, workplace behaviors, and inclusion and belonging. So thank you to each of you, Amalia, Anita, and Keith, and thank you to the folks out there for being just wonderful participants. Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Definitely thanks to the production team behind us.